Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are joining us. This is a webinar of the Africa Let's Partnership in cooperation with the Let's Energy Working Group and the Let's Finance Working Group. It will be a very interesting session we have ahead of us today, I hope. The topic is mini-grids for rural electrification and development. And we're specifically going to talk about enabling effective business models through well-designed policies. You're going to hear a little bit more from me in just a moment, but my role right now is just to introduce to you a welcome speaker who will also take over the moderation in the later part of this webinar. His name is Josh Ogada, close friend and colleague who has been instrumental in helping us organize this session here today. Josh is the knowledge management lead at South North. He co-leads the secretariat of the Africa Let's Partnership, which he is going to introduce to you in a moment. And he has worked for a range of NGOs over many years in the areas of sustainable development, environmental and social justice, gender, climate change, energy. And Josh is going to give the welcome and introduction to you, and then back to me later. Josh.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to apologize for what felt like a brief delay. It was issues with our audio, which I'm sure are now sorted out. I'd like to extend a welcome to all our participants, those who are just joining the conversation. Welcome to our Africa Mini-Grids Community of Practice webinar on mini-grids for rural electrification and development. Just a couple of housekeeping notes as people continue to join. We will keep giving reminders of these, and if there's anybody has a question, of course they can let us know via the chat function, which I'm going to introduce you to right now. At the bottom of your screens as participants, you should see a chat box, which you can click on, which gives you the option to either chat with the panelists and participants or a specific panelist. So if you have any comments as we go along, whether it's an issue to do with the mechanics of the Zoom interface, please do not hesitate to type it in there, and one of our crew will make sure that that is sorted out. As we carry on with this webinar, there will be space and time for questions and answers. If you look at the bottom of your panel, of your Zoom panel, you'll see a little box that says Q&A. That is the box that you can click on that will allow you to type in your question. We would prefer if, as you're typing in your question, you do specify which specific speaker you'd like to answer your question. If you do this while the particular speaker is speaking, then the speaker will either have the option to answer your question live in the course of the presentation, or if they prefer that the flow of the presentation not be broken, then the question will remain there and shall be answered during the Q&A session. So we do encourage you to interact with us. Our speakers will have done quite a bit of work preparing these presentations, and I'm sure everybody will agree that one of the biggest gratifications of having done a presentation is when there is active engagement, whether it's in the form of questions or comments in the course during the Q&A session or in the course of the presentation. So we do appreciate your interacting with us through the Q&A function. Now, my role at this stage is quite simple. It is to give you a bit of a background to the AfLP and specifically the Africa Mini-Grids Community of Practice. The Africa Mini-Grids Community of Practice was convened back in June of 2017 at the sidelines of the Africa Carbon Forum. And this brings together government representatives from energy and the environment departments, rural electrification agencies, as well as national energy commissions. We also have members who are from the private sector, academia, and international organizations that either design, finance, or implement mini-grid systems. around the continent. In terms of its aims, the mini-grids community of practice aims to design effective policies and enable regulatory environment to foster strong collaboration and partnership between public and private sectors. We also seek to evaluate and promote proven business and ownership models and best practices to drive toward commercial viability, which of course is a major concern in the area. We also aim to see ways to access finance, including engagement with private sector, and as well as developing bankable project proposals and regulatory frameworks that can de-risk and attract private sector investment to the mini-grid sector. In terms of how useful this is for African policymakers and implementers, the community of practice offers a perfect opportunity to engage with the private sector development and investment community in order to understand what is needed to unlock investment. It's also a space where we learn it's a space for peer-to-peer learning between African governments, as well as the pioneers and early champions in the area of mini-grids around the world, in order to design policy and regulatory frameworks and create the enabling environments that we need. If I could just pause there for a second, in terms of our technical notes, could we ask that, if you are not, if you're a panelist and you're not presenting at the moment, it might be useful to keep your video off. If during the course of your presentation you need to switch your video on, then please feel free to do that. Just back to very quickly, in terms of the opportunities that this community of practice offers, finally, it offers access to new tools or discussion around new tools and technical assistance to develop country-specific, tailored policy, market, and financial solutions in the area of mini-grids. Just to touch very briefly on a key component of the Africa-Leds partnership is the Africa-Leds project, which is funded by the European Union and brings together the Leds Global Partnership, the Africa-Leds Partnership, UNEP, and the Kwame Nkrumah University of Technology. And the key objective of this is to lay the groundwork for successful LEDs and NDC implementation. Another objective is regional and Pan-African peer learning and sharing, which is one of those that cuts across all the work we do, whether it's the AfLP as a whole or the different communities of practice, whether this one or the AfLP community of practice. So far, the partner countries, we have Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, DRC, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, Mozambique, and Zambia. And at some point, we are hoping that we can increase the range and increase the partner countries for the Africa-Leds project as well. The other thing that I would very much like to point out is that we have what we call REAL, which is the Remote Expert Assistance for LEDs, which is a no-cost on-demand technical assistance and matchmaking service, which is available to government representatives to assist in advancing climate resilient and low emissions development strategies, policies, and programs. And if you would like to access REAL, we put the details up on the screen. They'll be coming up very shortly. But basically, in terms of who can access this REAL assistance, it is available to government actors and representatives, both at a national and a local level, as well as technical institutions, consultants, non-governmental organizations, and others who are working directly with governments. And in terms of how you can access or find out more about REAL, we shall be putting up on the screen very shortly the Africa-Leds Partnership REAL email address. Emails can be addressed to jesse@southsouthnorth.org. Which emails which comes directly to our AfLP co-secretariat, or you could also email Leds GP REAL. You could send an email to Karishma, whose email address is on the screen as well. But feel free to also visit the Leds GP REAL page, whose URL you can also see on your screen. Do not worry too much about noting these down. We will be able to send these details to you along with all the other details for the presentations following the webinar. You can also connect to REAL via the working groups and communities of practice, such as this one, the mini-grids one, or the AfLP community of practice. Now, I think I'm done in terms of my introductory bit. And for me, what is left now is to introduce my friend and colleague who's going to be taking over at this stage. You heard his voice first and he passed it on to me. That's Alexander Ochs, who's the managing director of SD Strategies. He's also the chair of the Let's GP Energy Working Group. He works in advising top government officials and the private sector representatives and has been doing this for over 20 years now. He is an expert in clean energy, senior expert at the Clean Energy Solutions Center. I spoke earlier on about real services, and he's one of the key experts that we have on the within the service that is able to offer real services to our partners and our clients. During the period 2009 to 2017, Alex was director of climate change and climate and energy at the World Watch Institute. So, with no further ado, can I pass over to you, Alex? Please, you can take over now.
Thank you very much, Josh. Again, it's a pleasure to have you all with us here today. We have an excellent set of panelists with us today. My role is to introduce you to the agenda today and to then lead into the discussion with the key presenters. And Josh will take over at the very end and moderate the Q&A to make sure that your voice gets been heard and you can ask your questions. I've only put on one slide here on the Let's Energy Working Group because I'm eager to jump into the topic of today. And we have a very dense program, as you will see in a moment when I pull up the agenda. The Energy Working Group brings together more than 500 energy sector practitioners under the roof of the Let's Global Partnership. From all regions of the LSGP, it's national governments, it's multilateral institutions, NGOs, and also the private sector who is involved in the work that we do. One of our key areas of activity is to support the regional LSGP platforms like the Africa Let's platform with whom we have been organizing the session here today. But we also operate closely with other sectoral platforms, say in the area of land use and land use change, national, subnational integration, or transport. Our priority areas are to establish and steer communities of practice, like the one we're doing here today on mini-grids in Africa. We do another one on bioelectricity in Latin America and the Caribbean, grid integration in Asia. We provide technical assistance to the regions and individual countries, including through REAL. We also work on case studies, webinars, toolkits, and provide other so-called go-to sources for those countries that have decided to engage in the Let's Global Partnership. Let's see. So let me introduce the agenda and the topic to you, and then introduce the first speaker today. We've heard a warm welcome and introduction to the AfLP from Josh Ogada. It's me now speaking, and then we turn to our first speaker. His name is Nico Peterschmidt from Enensis, who will talk about mini-grids, policy trends, as well as several recent observations in terms of risks for grids. That's very much at the center of his presentation, risks that project developers are facing and that governments can help them through their enabling environments to address. We then turn to an overview of African policy approaches to support mini-grids. There's quite some regional diversity, and we're eager to hear from Aaron Leopold about the differences there. And then we're going to do a first 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session, which I will moderate, and then we lead into business cases. So the first part that you, as you see here, is focused more on the policy side, on the environment for investments, the legislative and policy environments for investments and for developers in Africa. The second part is then providing business perspectives, and we have three speakers in that second part. who are operating in different regions of Africa, Central, Eastern, and Western Africa. As we will see, the legislative environment and the environment for investments and the resulting business cases that are successful within those environments are quite different. So we have these three sub-regional perspectives that we would like to share with you. And then hopefully there's still going to be enough time for a summary and a wrap-up and question and answer that Josh will lead again. One introduction to the topic. Most of you, having seen the list of participants from the session today, are experts on this. A few of you are new to the issue, but of course we're having some important issues at stake here. 1.1 billion people worldwide still do not have access to electricity. This number is reduced, which is good news. This is a success for the United Nations and individual countries and regions who are working on the challenge of providing access to energy to all. More than half of this 1.1 billion people, 600 million, live in sub-Saharan Africa, so the region that is in focus at this webinar here today. The United Nations has set an important goal as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 7, which is to achieve universal access to energy by 2030. And this is energy access that is sustainable and affordable and reliable. So it will be based largely on efforts at energy efficiency, energy savings, and renewable energy sources. So the renewables are at the center of today's session as well. Of course, there's an important climate aspect to this. The United Nations Framework Convention aims to keep levels of greenhouse gases at a level that doesn't pose greater risks to the environment and human beings. The goal has been set as 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius in the century. And energy is obviously a key sector to achieve those climate goals. There's huge health impacts as well as other gender, social impacts of transitioning to sustainable energy systems, of course. And the case for mini-grids is, of course, an important one. Some of the slides that I'm going to show to you now, a couple of slides I'm going to show to you now, are actually discussing where is the sweet spot for mini-grids, other ways, other approaches, other technical installations to provide energy access are, of course, also standalone systems, as well as grid extension, but grid extension is often costly and slow and faces its own challenges in many sub-Saharan African regions. Most importantly, there where there is not yet a national grid to speak of, where terrains are very difficult to reach and where density of populations are very low. I have another slide for this in a moment. The International Energy Agency in 2017 came out with a report that said that photovoltaic in off-grid systems and mini-grids are the least cost solution for 75% of the additional connections that need to be made in sub-Saharan Africa. 44% need to come from mini-grids. So almost half of new connections have to come from mini-grids. This is a visual that shows what I was mentioning a moment ago, which is, you might want to say, the mini-grid space or the sweet spots where mini-grids can make most of the difference, or are hopefully or likely going to make most of the difference in our electrification efforts. And you see at the very bottom, at the x-axis, the different indicators under which you can measure or depending on which the cost estimates for different technological installations and approaches changes. Of course, the size of the community in large cities that are close to or to the national grid, or where the national grid already is, grid extension is often the least costly option because the density of population is large. But if you are living in a village that's far off the national grid with a low density of population, then of course that changes the cost estimate significantly. and standalone systems or mini grids might be the smarter option to go, and the solution, or in this part the right solution that governments will pursue. So at the very top you see that standalone systems, solar home system, Pico PV are relatively costly per unit, but their cost hardly changes if you move from largely dense, largely populated areas like cities to cities that are far away. They of course increase slightly, but not as much as the other extreme grid extension would do, which might be the cheapest option in densely populated areas, as I mentioned, but where the cost curve rises very, very quickly if you move to areas that are far off the grid and not as populated. So what you see in the middle, then the two graphs, the top graph is for solar, diesel, biomass, and a hybrid of the above mini grids, and the bottom one for hydro mini grids. And it is really in these areas that are in a way in between grid extension and solar home systems where mini grids have likely the largest role to play. Not an exclusive one like standalone systems. Mini grids can also operate in areas close to the grid. Standalone systems can as well. And then these questions, whether they are feasible there, whether they are affordable there, whether they are a potential solution, depend on a number of other questions that we've put up here on the right-hand side of the screen. The quality and the reliability of services that are needed, for example, because of the presence of commercial productive loads that require a high electricity voltage, operation management requirements, human resources and their availability, and the available business players in a specific environment, and the business models that they carry forward. All of these things are, of course, additional indicators to what technology ultimately works in a given place. This is my, sorry, I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. This is my last slide. Some key considerations that I believe we need to talk about today in this webinar. There is a number of key concerns and of key drivers of business decisions that business developers have upfront and central in their minds when they explore a specific country or a sub-region and explore it for the opportunities that their business model has there. And those are key issues also that governments have to keep in mind as they're trying to advance mini-grids through policies and measures and a consistent strategy. One, for example, is that of tariff setting, of course. So can mini-grids developers set their own price? Can they charge the consumer the price that they need to achieve to run profitably? Or is there a uniform tariff employed? Is their tariff in one or the other way related to the tariff that's been charged on the national grid? A second key concern is the importance of the arrival of the main grid. Often these processes, of course, work in parallel. People buy standalone systems, mini grids are being developed, and the grid is extended. So what happens if I have invested significant amounts of money in installing mini grids and then the national grid arrives? There need to be some sort of an arrangement in place to reduce the risk for mini grid developers. And a lot of experience have been made in this area more recently for how to do this smartly. Thirdly, the licensing and administrative procedures. In many places, we have supportive strategies been put into place by governments. We have high-flying goals for the role for mini-grids. We have support policies in place, but then the licensing and administrative procedures are lengthy, costly, intransparent. So that's another key area in which governments need to look to improve the business environment. Fourthly, the availability of grants. In the past, the availability of grants, of concessional support, concessional money, be it through domestic mechanisms or international funding, has been a prerequisite of investments in most places. So I think it will be interesting to discuss here today, are they still a necessity in the future? Why are they? Why is it worth the investment from public sources? But most importantly, how to then set it up right? Where is the right entry point for donor money, for grants? At what point of the value chain are the resources used most wisely and in the smartest possible way? Of course, if there is a national electrification strategy that's straight and clear and transparent and ambitious, and which sets some long-term goals, this is important because it provides some long-term security to investors and any other protagonists working in this field. Most African countries have made quite an effort and have come quite a long way in designing these broader electrification strategies, including institutions like rural energy agencies and so on and so forth. And so against this background, business happens, and the credibility of governments is really an important shaker and mover, so to speak, an important motivation or barrier for the private sector and investors to get involved in the market. So that's the next point as well. You have comprehensive policy, mandatory rules, transparent processes. This has often been underestimated as people think of the electricity market to some extent as a free-moving market. Of course, we need to set clear rules for investors and business developers to explore what their opportunities are and which business models can work. Last but not least, the question, are subsidies needed? We talked about grants already before, but there's many other ways to provide financial and fiscal support for investors and project developers. For example, tax exemptions, bringing down import barriers, and many other measures along those lines. So that was sort of my brief introduction, as a quick lay of the field, why it's important that we work on this issue, what's the role for mini-grids, and what are some of the key considerations that business developers and policymakers have up front and central. I think these issues we're going to touch on again in this webinar, throughout this webinar. So that leaves me to introduce the first speaker today. His name is Nico Peterschmidt. He's one of the most senior people in the field of mini-grids, around for, working on the issue for some 15 or 20 years by now, I believe. Nico is the co-founder and managing director of Inensis, which takes pride to be a one-stop shop, both for the private sector on mini-grids, as well as advising governments on smart mini-grid strategies. He has co-developed the award-winning micropower economy business and risk management model, so done a lot of quantitative work in addition to his policy advisory work, and been very active in Africa, but that's by no means the only continent he has been active on. Inensis runs several projects in Asia and other parts of the world as well. So Nico, I hope this works and you can take over and share your screen. Otherwise, I'm happy to lead you through your presentation.
Thank you, Alex. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I will share my screen now for the presentation. All right, I will talk today about the mini-grid policy trends. Close this quickly, otherwise I cannot see my own Okay. Just a quick introduction of my company and myself. As Alex already said, I'm the CEO and shareholder of Inensus, which is a mini-grid consultancy firm. I'm also director of Jumeme and Inersa, which are both joint ventures where Inensus is involved and which are decentralized utilities. These two companies actually run mini-grids in Tanzania and Senegal, respectively. I have co-authored a number of publications around mini-grid policy, for example, the mini-grid policy toolkit of EUI-PDF or respective IRENA publications on mini-grid policy. My company and I have also personally been involved very much in that drafted and co-drafted regulations for mini-grids in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Myanmar, and we also influenced a little bit on the policy in Uttar Pradesh, India, when it was started. We're currently supporting 60 mini-grid companies with consultancy services under the AfDB Green Mini-Grid Help Desk, which recently also has been extended to a Green Mini-Grid Policy Help Desks, which is supporting policymakers throughout Sub-Saharan Africa in getting their mini-grid policies right. So if you have got anything to do for us on your mini-grid policy, please get in touch. Then we also support governments through larger projects than this mini-grid help desk project, usually financed by United Nations, World Bank, GIZ, DFID. We also work in Asia for ITCOL a lot and a little bit in India, in the Philippines for the ADB. Mainly in designing mini-grid public-private partnership programs and projects. We basically identify the best opportunities to allocate grants to the mini-grid sector and attract private investments into the sector. Today I would like to talk to you about the three major risks. I would focus on two of them, which is the demand or volume risk in mini-grids, and second, the load pattern risk. And at the end, I would like to just roughly indicate where I see the mini-grid sector is going in the future. Mini-grids need a certain policy framework. Alex already indicated that, of course, the main grid connection risk has to be mitigated by certain regulatory rules. What happens when the main grid connects to the mini grid? Can the mini grid feed back into the main grid? Can the mini grid purchase electricity from the main grid, or can the assets be sold to the main grid operator? All these kind of things are there. Is there a compensation mechanism in place, and so on? There must be tariffs in place which are at the end help the mini grid operator to cover its cost, no matter if the mini grid operator is a public entity or a private entity. Or in the case of the public entity, and partly also in the private entity, there can be ongoing cross-subsidization schemes from the main grid, which have their own challenges. This has, Alex has already introduced, we are now going one step deeper into the mini-grid operation and the requirements for policy that supports successful and sustainable mini-grid operation. And that is actually determined by these three factors that I mentioned already: the electricity demand risk, the load pattern risk, and the overspending and technical performance risk. Today I would like to talk mainly about the electricity demand risk and the load pattern risk. So now there are usually plans like financial models, financial projections on how much demand there will be in a certain village, electricity demand. And there are certain projections of how the load pattern in that village will look like. So if there is more load in the morning or in the afternoon or in the evening, that is usually part of the projection. If reality matches these projections, then at the end, the mini-grid will be sustainable. If the projections are to some extent wrong or reality does not meet those projections, then at the end, the mini-grid will suffer from financial losses, and that will make the mini-grid unsustainable. And that is actually independent on of whether you want to go for a private sector approach or a public sector approach. At the end, if the money is missing to sustain operation, the mini-grid will fail. So these three factors will determine if the mini-grid will fail or not. And policy can play a very important role to make sure that these factors, that the projections and the reality match, or that the reality can be adjusted to the projections, or the projections can be adjusted to reality. I will show you how that works. Let's first go into the demand or volume risk. These are some curves showing the development of demand compared to the projected demand over time. On the x-axis, you see the number of months of operation after commissioning. On the y-axis, you will see the percentage of demand, electricity demand, compared to the projected demand. What is important is that all these villages, like each line is drawn for a specific community and a specific mini-grid. All these mini-grids have been analyzed using the same demand assessment methodology. But at the end, they turned out to be completely different. The demands developed slowly or they developed fast, and it could not really easily be projected. Our understanding is that this is very much dependent on the trust relationship between the operator and the community. If the community trusts the mini-grid operator, the community invests, individual businessmen invest into productive use of electricity. At the end, electricity demand will increase and the mini-grid operator will reach its projected demand more quickly. And also the success of households and businesses in raising funds from banks, from MFIs, from family and friends to purchase electric appliances. And that success in acquiring these funds determines also very strongly the demand uptake. At the end, what we have to say is that demand cannot really easily be projected. And therefore, this demand risk is a significant risk in mini-grids. If you cannot project the demand, you design your system for a certain demand, and then if the demand is less than your projection, then suddenly you don't earn the money that you need to sustain your operation. And this is what this diagram shows. On the y-axis, you see costs and revenues. On the x-axis, you see the annual electricity sales, like the number of kilowatt hours sold per year. You see a revenue curve and a cost curve. Where the revenue and the cost curve intercept, that is the break-even point. Right of that point, the mini-grid runs sustainably and generates profits. The problem is that usually in the mini-grid space, the generation capacity is limited. And here I give some examples for solar battery systems, where there is really a very strict limitation of how much power and energy can be supplied to the village. Now here, the vertical line is the limitation for energy. That is where you actually design what you design your system for, from a capacity perspective and also from a financial perspective. If you sell less, much less than this, you actually are below the break-even point. You make losses, and at the end, your system will not survive. The same happens if you have a demand which is much higher than what you can actually supply to the community. Then your customers will be unsatisfied, and at the end, they will not be ready to pay for your electricity because they do not get the electricity that they need, and at the end, your system will be unsustainable. Therefore, in many cases, diesel generators are introduced because diesel generators can widen the gap, like can widen the slot. Still you have your demand, and if it's lower, then still you may run into some challenges. And therefore, there are more measures of how to spread this gap. You want to have it as wide as possible to have a sustainable operation for as many demands, like as much demand as the mini-grids and the village actually develops. And that another option is to actually increase fixed cost in a revenue. The fixed cost in the revenue curve is the y-axis interception, whereas the variable cost is the inclination of the revenue curve. So if you start at a higher y-axis interception, have a higher fixed cost for your customer, and have a lower inclination, meaning a lower variable cost per kilowatt hour sold, then at the end, your let's say slots within which your mini-grid can be operated sustainably will be widened further. And then suddenly you can even, with a relatively low demand, still survive. One mistake that many policymakers and also grant funding programs especially make is the requirement of a minimum renewable fraction. And if you have a minimum renewable fraction, then your maximum capacity of electricity sold decreases. Meaning that at some point you cannot generate more diesel, like more electricity from diesel, even in a short period of time, and therefore your capacity is limited. Another option that policymakers have to meet this demand risk is a tariff adjustment mechanism that is based on a tariff regulation, which is overseen by an independent regulatory authority, which is basically free from political interference. As soon as you have that in place, mini-grid operators can trust in your regulatory authority, and the regulatory authority may adjust tariffs slightly to make mini-grids sustainable again, in case the demand doesn't develop as expected. The second risk I would like to talk about quickly is the load pattern risk. You usually have your projections for your financial model and your system design. And in this curve, it is the blue curve with a projection. And then you see, this is a real example from a live mini-grid. You see the actual curve, and the actual curve developed differently than the projected curve. Especially during daytime, you have here in the real curve much less demand than in the evening and in the morning, which means that in fact your battery is depleted very early at night. The diesel generator starts earlier, you have got a higher fuel consumption, your fixed cost due to the capex of course stay the same, and during daytime, and this is what this diagram shows, you actually lose electricity, and that is this blue area on top of the columns. You lose this energy, which you could theoretically generate and store in your batteries and then supply to your customers or supply to your customers directly, just because your batteries are full. Because the batteries have been designed for a stronger daytime load and a lower nighttime load. But as now in reality the daytime load is much lower and the nighttime load is much stronger, the system would need much larger batteries. Larger batteries means more capex. More capex means higher tariffs. At the end, the mini-grid operator can take a decision on whether he wants to either go for larger batteries, or if he wants to go for diesel generators, like a longer diesel generator run times. And in many cases, mini-grid operators in this stage are already quite frustrated, because they are already running out of liquidity, because the cash is not really coming in, and there's more cash going out for the diesel, that they just say, okay, let's reduce the risk and reduce the capex, and therefore they usually rather pay for more diesel than investing into the renewable source. One way of actually mitigating this risk is time of use tariff, so-called demand management. There's also load management, which differs from demand management. Demand management means that in a solar system, for example, daytime tariffs, electricity tariffs would be lower than nighttime electricity tariffs, meaning that electricity customers have a strong incentive to use electricity during daytime and use less electricity during nighttime, because that would be more expensive. There could also be load management, where the mini-grid system operator switches off, for example, pumping loads actively during daytime when there is enough solar electricity available. Let me summarize quickly. At the end, the recommendations to policymakers from the learnings of the slides that I presented before are allow staged implementation. This is actually the risk mitigation instrument for mini-grid operators. They start with a smaller capex. They start with a smaller system and see how the demand is developing over time. They can adjust the system by adding more batteries, more solar, or whatever renewable source they are actually using, to come up with the lowest cost of electricity for the demand and the load pattern that they will see after some time. And usually after some 1 to 2 years, you can see the trajectory of demand development. And that is the time when you can actually design your system for the real demand. Therefore, policymakers should, when designing public-private partnership projects for mini-grids, or also when designing their own mini-grids, consider staged implementation over a period of at least 3 years. Please also reduce the minimum renewable fraction requirement in your programs, because that, as I have shown in one of the earlier slides, reduces or increases the risk for demand, the demand risk for the mini-grid operator. Then third point is, let the regulator set the tariffs. Make the regulator as independent as possible from political interference, because that is the only opportunity for mini-grid operators to really have a trust relationship with the regulator and trust that the regulator will help them out and make their business sustainable in case the demand doesn't develop as expected, or if the load pattern doesn't develop as expected. On the other hand, of course, the regulator must make sure that the private sector does not exploit the situation and artificially overestimate the demand at the beginning, for example, or come up with a completely wrong load pattern assumption. Last but not least, allow fixed tariff components, especially for those customers which are a little bit better off, the better, like the wealthier customers. This reduces the risk of the mini-grid operator a lot. And of course, use time, allow time of use tariffs, allow the mini-grid operators to have lower daytime tariffs in solar systems, for example, or lower nighttime tariffs in hydro systems, for example. And now, last but not least, I would like to give you a quick introduction into where I see the mini-grid sector going, and that future of mini-grids holds also some promises for reduced tariffs and also additional benefits for the rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. I strongly believe that the future mini-grid rollouts will be driven by natural resources that are owned by the community and that are mastered by the community, but which are not fully exploited by the community because there are some specific competences missing. These resources could, for example, be as simple as fresh grass for beef, or grounds for fishing, soil for agriculture, or artisanal mines. At the end, these natural resources can only be accessed in the large scale if mini-grids are available locally. And the mini-grids being available locally means that not only electricity for processing of the goods is available, but also logistics competences of the mini-grid operator and the management competences of the mini-grid operator are available on site. In many cases, according to my experience, the staff of the mini-grid operator is part of the most educated people in rural communities, and therefore synergies can be drawn from that. The village community at the same time provides, has got the ownership and the knowledge of the resources. And if those two work together, then we can generate something that we call the key maker model. Whereas the key maker, or the key is the mini-grid, the key to access resources that have been inaccessible to a wider market. And the key maker is the mini-grid operator, which works together with the community and then makes the mini-grid business profitable through an additional revenue stream coming in through the trade and sales and process of the local resources in cooperation with the local community. My company, Inensos, as I said, has a subsidiary in Tanzania called Jumeme. We are currently testing this model on islands in Lake Victoria. We freeze fish using our own electricity on the islands. We work very closely with the fishermen. We deliver that frozen fish to Dar es Salaam, to the capital, and we are actually deliver the freshest fish, especially the freshest tilapia possible in Dar es Salaam. And we have got a very good reputation for that. We can generate quite an attractive margin, and we share that margin with the community. And the community is quite happy about that. Actually, we pay more for the fish than anybody else. And therefore, we generate an additional revenue stream to the community while making our mini-grid investment profitable. And that in the future, if this is exploited properly, may even help reducing mini-grid tariffs, which is usually the main concern of policymakers in the long run. Thank you for now. The results of the first part of the presentation have been taken from research that have been conducted under the Green Mini-Grid Help Desk of the African Development Bank, which Inensos is implementing in cooperation with Energy for Impact. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nico. This was a very interesting discussion and number of risks and also risk mitigants that we're going to discuss later on. You made me hungry for tilapia, and you also made me hungry for more of a discussion. I'd like to introduce the next speaker to you. I hope you can see the right screen here. Hold on a second.
So I don't think that I have the screen yet.
How do I move to this? Yeah, here. This one, and then there. Yeah. And you'll be on just in a second. Just to make sure. Yeah, PowerPoint. Full screen. All right. So our next speaker is Aaron Leopold. He's going to speak about African policy approaches, providing you an overview of mini-grids policies in the region. Aaron is the Africa Mini-Grid Developers Association's CEO. I think still a relatively recent setup. And he's also on the board of directors of the Alliance for Rural Electrification. He used to be with Practical Action and worked on rural electrification in a number of different settings. Aaron, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think you need to pass the screen to me. I'm viewing your screen right now. Here we go. Oh, I can share it now. So here we go. Sorry, I've got it now. Can you all see my screen?
We can.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, Nico, for the deep dive into what makes a mini-grid work at the individual site level. I want now to kind of zoom out and take a look at some of the different policy trajectories that governments and industries can take to sort of move the entire sector in one way or another. So just to kind of reframe why we are talking about mini-grids. You know, utilities have a very limited set of tools in their toolboxes, and the mini-grid and the solar home system sector have recently emerged with new and different tools, which is on the one hand exciting, but on the other hand challenging because they represent new ways of doing things. And whenever change happens, you know, it can be kind of scary, but it also means there's a change in different dynamics of decision making and of service provision. So we need to be very sure about what we are doing. The African Mini Grid Developers Association was created out of a meeting between the World Bank and mini grid developers in Eastern Africa 2 years ago. The idea came 2 years ago. And the objective was really to help improve the transparency and understanding of the mini grid sector by both financiers and policymakers. We still are in a phase of the mini grid sector where as Nico very, very clearly described, there are a lot of questions that remain around how to secure demand and how to predict demand. And of course, when you're talking about predicting and securing demand, you're also basically talking about securing and predicting payments. And payments are very important from a utility perspective. They're very important for, they're even more important for a business perspective. So what we need for financiers to basically buy into and invest in the mini grid sector is this security around payments. So AMDA was on the one hand created to help kind of demystify and create a data benchmark for the mini grid space, but also to share these learnings with policymakers and financiers. So you'll see right there that our mandate and our value addition is around this data benchmarking. And the reason or the way we are going to be able to do this is each member of AMDA signs up to voluntarily provide data on each of their sites. So we are going to be creating the world's largest database of information around cost per connection, kilowatt hour price, types of financing that mini grid companies receive, quality of service, demand changes over time, all of these things that would be valuable both for financiers, but also for policymakers in improving their ability to do integrated planning and to better understand what is the best fit for their country. So what I am talking about and what Nico just kind of gave you a great introduction to is that governing energy can seem very complex. And if you talk to Nico or I, we can both get very, very deep into these complexities, but also on the face of it, you know, what Nico was describing was that we have a very expensive asset in a poor community, and either we need to bring down the cost of that asset or we need to bring up the ability of communities to pay for that asset. It's as simple as that. All the other charts and graphs that Nico showed you were essentially ways to think about how to plan for this and how to improve this ability to pay and the cost of the system. So what I'm going to describe to you here is different ways to think about energy that might seem complex, but I'm going to simplify them for you as well. So energy, as I write here, can be infrastructure or a product like a solar home system, you know, just a solar panel and a battery, or it can be a service. So also generation can be centralized or decentralized, and it can be owned publicly or privately. And in many cases, it is a mix of all of those things. And finally, as I mentioned before, mini grids and solar home systems are examples of how quickly this technology is changing. So how do we govern and create policy for something this complex? Well, it's actually one of Nico's books that he contributed to very, very heavily, the Mini Grid Policy Toolkit, which can help clarify quite a bit of this. And I highly recommend that all of you, if you haven't already, take a look at this document. It's available online. It is available in English, en français et en portugais. So EUEI PDF has done a very good job at making this as accessible as possible. It's a very, very informative document. And this next slide here is from that book. And it's an example of the decision-making process, which I'm going to go into in two country examples in the next slide. The two country examples are Nigeria and Kenya. Oops, sorry. If someone is seeing chats that are asking questions, please let me know so I can answer those questions. Otherwise, I'm going to ignore the question box that's popping up. So the decision-making process at the national level really needs to make one major decision to begin with, and that is, are we going to basically take a centralized approach or a decentralized approach? Is the utility going to retain primary control and management and financial responsibility over the energy system in the country? Or is it going to be a mixed or decentralized approach where the private sector comes in? Now, in all European and American and in Japan as well, the so-called OECD countries, it was a mixed group to begin with, but eventually they have all evolved to be mixed or private sector approaches. So more over to the right side of your screen. And you'll see that even within the sort of the choice 1 or choice 2 of centralized or decentralized, when we move down to the actual operations, we have a variety of hybrid, private, community, and public sector models. So this decision-making tree, again, is just one of the useful tools that can be found in the mini-grid policy toolkit, and I encourage you all to look at it. Next, I just wanted to go directly into our case study examples because we have limited time. So what we have here is on the left, matching to the centralized approach on the previous slide is the example of Kenya, and on the right we have the decentralized approach which Nigeria has taken. So let's just go through Kenya's choice. Kenya has a very strong centralized utility. We have Kenya Power here. It used to be KPLC. It is now just Kenya Power. Who negotiated recently a very important deal with the World Bank for the world's first large-scale loan to an African government for off-grid energy. So this is very important because the government of Kenya truly believes that it can pay back this money because it believes in off-grid. And the same goes for Nigeria. Nigeria is in the process of negotiating with the World Bank a large results-based financing program for mini-grids as a loan. It also believes that it can pay back these loans because the technology has evolved so much that these countries are fully on board. So just going back to the Kenya example, Kenya Power has decided that the utility wants to retain ownership of these assets, of mini-grids, and the government will select the location of the mini-grids. And the government will determine the price per kilowatt hour that these mini-grids will be charging. Now, if you go over to Nigeria, Nigeria is taking a very different approach. Nigeria has a lot of people to electrify. It has a very complex electrification network, but it has hundreds of millions of people that are unelectrified. So they decided they need all the help that they could get, essentially. And they have chosen a private ownership model to maximize the speed of rural electrification because they know that their utility cannot move as quickly as they need to. And in this case, we're not talking about mini-grid companies, really. We're talking about decentralized utilities. And AMDA very much favors this approach because of the reasons that I will go to in a moment. And in this case, Nigeria is also allowing mini-grid companies or decentralized utilities to negotiate prices with communities. This is an important difference that we'll go into in a second. So in these different contexts, what is the role of the mini-grid company? Well, on the left in Kenya, mini-grids are essentially a tool of the government to reach underserved areas where the grid cannot economically go. And mini-grid companies are essentially then service providers. They will not own the mini-grids. They will only construct them and operate them. In Nigeria, we have a very different approach again, where the decentralized utilities are seen as reducing a burden for governments. So the governments can concentrate or focus on building out the grid in cities, on improving the quality of grid infrastructure, and essentially focusing on expansion where expansion makes sense and they don't feel the pressure of going to every corner of the country. And here, in this case, the decentralized utilities are private sector owners and operators of the grids that they build. So now we're going to go into the advantages and disadvantages of each. So I want you to take a look at the Kenya example again first. So the main advantage is really that, like I said, the government has just done a deal with the World Bank. It's very easy to access finance for governments, even in challenging contexts. And it is also potentially easier to cross-subsidize rural connections because were cross-subsidizing within one organization, within the national utilities. So on the other hand, the Nigerian example has many advantages as well, because they are private sector entities. We have a really high incentive to improve demand in rural economies. Going back to Nico's example, this is central to the survival of the mini-grid. We also have a very high incentive for good quality energy service, because if the energy turns off, then they are not earning any money. There's also a high incentive for good customer service, because we want to expand the number of connections. At each individual mini-grid, it's often the case, as Nico mentioned, that demand builds over time. This is because initially, maybe 30% or 50% of the community will be connected. And as they learn about the good customer service and the benefits that come along, more and more people will join. So the quality is very important there. And there's a high incentive to improve efficiency and reduce costs, which at the end of the day can lead to reduced costs for the customers. So now, if we look for the disadvantages, you'll see something quite interesting. The disadvantages for the Nigerian example is that it is very challenging for companies to raise finance, to go into these unpredictable rural communities. However, in the Kenyan case, we said that it was easy to raise finance, if you recall. And also, in the Kenyan example, we mentioned how rural pricing can be easier to cross-subsidize with urban or wealthier customers. And again, this is a disadvantage in the Nigerian context, where pricing can be more political, because of course mini-grids are more expensive per unit of electricity, but communities are willing to pay. It is better to have something than to have nothing. And we have seen time and again, it is politicians that make the price an issue, not the communities. In the overwhelming majority of cases, the communities are happy to have some electricity, to earn some money, to have a better medical facility, to have a better school. And it's the local politicians or the national politicians that make a problem in this context. So, interestingly, if you look at the other side, where the Nigerian case has a very high incentive to provide good services, lower prices, improve local demand, which also means improve jobs, improve local economies. The Kenyan example, where centralized utilities retain control, these are actually disincentivized. So a utility has very little incentive to work with a rural community on job building. Most utilities never think that this is any part of their responsibility. The quality, as we know, in many African countries, the further you get from the city center, the worse the power becomes, because the population is smaller, the votes are smaller, the voices are smaller, the economies are smaller. There's also very little incentive for good customer service. And the problem is, the biggest problem for me at least, is that if the government can't get to you, then you get nothing. Because when the government dictates where the communities are electrified, those that are left behind, there are no mini-grid companies to electrify them, because that is not the model. In Nigeria, if there are communities that are left behind by the government, the private sector companies can go there and electrify them. And this is really the only way to achieve universal access. So, and again, there's little incentive to increase efficiency or reduce a subsidy, because public utilities, all public utilities in Africa are essentially subsidized by donors. So there's little incentive to reduce that. So I realize that I'm going over time, so I'm going to jump very quickly through this next part. This next slide, I wanted to just share, irrespective of whether you choose a public or a private model, really, you need to have a couple of different characteristics to basically bring in the right type of people to do these jobs, even if you're a government that has decided to retain control. We need to have a demonstrated, dedicated mini-grids policy and energy planning. If there's no policy and no planning, we're not going to see this. And these plans have to be stable and long-lived to get companies interested in moving into your country. If they think the policy is going to change next year, they're going to say, why should I bother training people, hiring people, investing in the country, etc. They need to be very clear so companies know what they are jumping into. And they need to be accessible. one of the challenges in Kenya, where I am right now, is that the Kenyan electrification strategy, the draft was published well over a year ago, and we're still waiting. Every month we're told it's coming next month, it's coming next month. And meanwhile, all the companies are just waiting and waiting and waiting. So they are not investing. It's very, very simple. We need to have cost-effective and efficient plans. Light-handed and simplified. This means that the policies cannot be 1,000 pages long. They need to be very clear and easy to understand. And they need to be transparent and predictable and technology neutral, because we want the best technology for the job, not the best technology for the politicians. And the last one is that they need to be streamlined and flexible, as Nico said in the last presentation. Have something that's flexible over time, because the context is unpredictable, the technologies are changing, we need to remain flexible as well. So what we just talked about was the policy side of things. There are many more, these are some of the details of the policy aside from the overall approach. We need to have an institutional framework. We have to look at taxes and duties, regulations, permits, etc., policies and plans, technical standards, tariffs, etc. If we look at the main green things here, these are the government's responsibility. And then on the right, we have the local activity side. We also have to look at the business models, and we also have to look at the finance. I am not going through this slide, but you can find it in another policy document that is called Building Energy Access Markets. Again, that is called Building Energy Access Markets, and that is published by EU EIPDF also, the same organization that published the policy toolkit. Lastly, the key takeaways, basically on the general policy directions that a country can take is, are you going to choose the private sector as a service provider to the government, or are you going to choose the private sector as a partner in rural electrification? And again, really the focus is on these incentives from my perspective and from the perspective of the sector. We would, as a mini-grid sector, we would much rather be a partner than a service provider, because we think that these incentives really show that we can do an amazing job in helping you as governments achieve your national objectives. And for this last point, because we think the disadvantages of the service provider model, they involve so much government and utility change. If we want to create government incentives to improve demand, government incentives to improve quality, etc., this really requires a lot of political change, institutional change, power dynamics, retraining, all of these things that are complicated, expensive, and time-consuming. But the partner model they bring these things automatically. So all of these bonuses are there from the beginning. And that's why we really feel that there's an opportunity in the partner model, much more so than in the service provider model. So with that, I wanted to say thank you very much. My contact information is right here, and I'm sure the organizers of this event will share it to you. And I always want to end on a positive note, and this is my favorite photograph from all of Energy Access. You know, it is about people at the end of the day, and that's why we're all here. None of the mini-grid companies out there in the world today are there to do something easy. They have all chosen the most difficult job in the electrification space because we all really care, and we want to work with you on solving these great challenges. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and we look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron. We were supposed to have a first quick round of questions and answers, and I see questions and answers coming in. So your comments are really motivating a lot of folks here on this webinar to use the chat window. If I could ask you for questions and not just comments on what you've been hearing, to move those into the question and answer section of your screen and ask your questions there from now on. We're going to try to make sure that we address as many as possible in the Q&A afterwards, but we're going to skip this the Q&A that were this first round and move this towards the end in the interest of time. So I'm going to move on to introduce the next speaker to you, Mukabanji Mutanuka, who is with NG Power Corner. She has been working in the field for a long time. She's based in Zambia, now responsible for business and commercial development for Power Corner in Zambia. And before that, she led the White House initiative, the US-led initiative Power Africa in Zambia. Mukabanji, I hope you can take over the screen. Karen, can you give Mukabanji? Yes, this is looking good. Wonderful.
Hello, Mukabanji, could you please just check that you're not on mute? And if you don't mind, please maximize your screen. Great, that's perfect, but I think you're still on mute. Please unmute your microphone.
Is that better?
That's better, thank you. Yes, yeah, please go ahead now.
Okay, so that's a brief outline of my presentation today. So I'd like to present who we are as Power Corner and our relationship to ENGIE. So ENGIE is a French electricity utility, one of the biggest in the world. We have a presence in over 70 countries, over 150,000 employees. And originally, ENGIE has been known to be operating in natural oil and gas, but quite recently, ENGIE branched off into renewable energy. And so of interest on these statistics that I've put here is a 1 billion investment into innovation and digital. And why is that? It's because it's necessitated our 3D transformation, which is decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization, which will resonate with the purpose for this webinar. So how does ENGIE do its business? As Power Corner, we were created as an incubation project under the ENGIE group to develop and operate mini-grids with a view to unlock the economic and development potential of rural areas across Africa. So how does ENGIE do it? That is through Power Corner 1 and through the acquisition of Phoenix late October last year. So we're mixing solar home system provision and mini-grid operations to provide energy access to the last mile customer, because we understand that where mini-grids cannot reach, solar home systems will definitely reach there. So energy access, the question would be, why mini-grids and why Africa? You agree with me that for Africa, Africa is the continent with the least electrification access. And this challenge certainly presents an opportunity to do something innovative and something that would change people's lives with a view to leave no one behind. And so, what is our mini-grid story at ENGIE? Our mini-grid story started with Tanzania at a small pilot in Ketumbeni, which is up north. And the reasons for us choosing Tanzania were obviously geographic reasons, economic reasons, and the favorable regulatory framework that we found in Tanzania. So when we started our operations in Ketumbeni, we found that we had a supportive mechanism of a result-based financing, which enabled us to prove our concept and also scale it up to at least 8 operational mini-grids as of this year. So you can see some of those spots that are put in green, those were operational mini-grids as of June this year, and the blue ones are secured sites, and the orange ones are sites that we intend to get into and are under construction. So what does our business model look like? We have the traditional generation unit, our distribution grids, which are our assets together with the smart meters, and we offer services to clearly define what our model is. So on the asset side, you find that we have our generation and storage, that is the CapEx that we pay for upfront, the distribution grid, as well as the MEP and digital. We invest so much in all of this to make sure that the system runs and operates smoothly so that the end client will be able to enjoy the service and actually get a revenue out of it. And apart from the sale of electricity, we do offer other services which are efficient appliances, and these are household or productive use equipment, so that we can be able to boost income generation activities within the local community and also just boost the economy, the local economy GDP in that area. In Tanzania, for instance, in certain kiosks that we have, we've been able to try out energy services such as Wi-Fi to the community, because we understand that the world is globally becoming connected through internet, but that should not discredit people living in the rural areas. So our positioning on the value chain starts from the village selection all the way up to operation and maintenance, and depending on the country that we enter into or the village that we enter into, sometimes we do outsource certain services such as village selection and installation. We understand that sometimes it's not too easy to understand certain dynamics of a certain country or maybe a certain region in a specific country. So sometimes it's better to sit in with the locals who understand all those dynamics that would suit our criteria of us developing and operating a mini grid. Installation also, sometimes you find that in certain areas or in certain countries, the regulator would be much comfortable having a local EPC contractor doing all the EPC works and all the maintenance works just from the start of the project in order to issue with a license. So that is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and it depends on the country that we're entering. So our sizing methodology and optimization, I know most mini-grid providers have something similar to this. We use our GIS data, site visit data, and historical data that we gather from our partners locally on the ground to do the first sizing of our systems to be able to see whether or not we'll be able to meet the demand profile, the demand that we certainly assess to get from that area, or maybe we'll be able to see if we'll be in tune with the load patterns that Nico earlier spoke about. So our overview of our micro-utility platform, this micro-utility platform allows us to interface with our clients and also be able to keep a rich database of our client history to see what their consumption patterns are. What incentives would we bring in to actually change the dynamics of demand from this one particular client who's a productive user and one particular client who's a household user. So what is our scale up? That was a brief overview of what we started with in Tanzania. So we have 8 operational sites, and the second country of operation right now for Power Corner is Zambia. And the specific reasons why we came through to Zambia will be similar to the geographic and demographic reasons I spoke about Tanzania, the economic reasons, and also the favorable regulatory framework. You'll agree with me that the mini-grid industry is fairly nascent in Zambia, and the Energy Act of 1994 does not appropriately correspond to the needs of the off-grid sector, and more especially the mini-grid sector, which will need the regulator to come in and sit in to understand what your business model looks like in terms of the price that you're going to charge for the electricity. But what we understood is that there's a lot of international appetite coming into the off-grid sector, especially in Zambia, and also the commitment coming in from the Zambian government to try and review the reforms and the energy policy, especially around mini-grids. What else do we do as NG and Power Corner? So in order to promote local economic development, we procure the type of appliances that our local clients would prefer to say, okay, I would need probably a hammer mill or an oil processing machine of this quality. But then once we do that, we do not just procure anyhow. We look for the most energy efficient appliances because we want to create a win-win situation. In one way, we're creating awareness about energy efficiency, and in the other way, we're creating a small anchor client within that local economy who has the ability to grow. In the end, it's all about people. And from our experience in Tanzania, what we've noticed as key drivers of success, especially in the way we plan our business model, in the way we plan our pricing, and in the way we forecast for growth, is that we have to adapt this to three things. That is the ability to pay. We're bringing in a very high cost solution that should be able to meet up with people. Either the cost should be brought down or we increase the customer's ability to be able to pay. Our cost reflectivity to ensure adequate return and also competitiveness versus other sources of energy. We do different simulations in our different community engagements so people can actually create a serious buy-in to understand and see the different variations that a better power quality source gives them in relation to another power source that they've been using before we actually came through into that area. And as part of our scale up, we want to understand different specificities in Zambia, for instance. We're also understanding specificities in different countries within Africa, because we know that the entry system will not be the same for different countries. And we want to do that so that we can actually clearly give out our growth plan and also be able to scale up to different countries and use the experiences from different countries to redefine our business models. Then we also want to continue to sell appliances, because we understand in most of these rural areas it's difficult to get upfront cash and to actually find an anchor client. So we want to build anchor clients within the small entrepreneurial prevalence that we already find in those rural areas. Then we want to use our R&D to develop productive uses and also develop new services. For example, an electric bike, I've never been on one, but maybe this could something that could work for Africa. In a nutshell, we believe that mini grids really are the solution to respond to the target of the Vision 2030 as well as SDG number 7. We believe that certainly mini grids are the future. I thank you all for your attention and thank you for the opportunity.
Great, thank you, Mukabanji.
Thank you very much, Mukabanji. Next speaker is Robert Cunningham. Robert has recently joined RVA Seoul and Kudura to drive its expansion, as they hope, from pilot to powerhouse. He leads the canyon operations of Kudura, interferes with governments, with the local communities, and oversees the compliance with the regulatory environment and the safety, health, environment, and quality protocols. He has also, before joining RVE, launched and scaled 2 successful startups in sub-Saharan Africa. Robert?
Great, thanks for the introduction. Just a quick hi to everyone that's here, and I'm just going to shut off my video for the sake of saving some bandwidth here. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So my name is Robert Cunningham. I'm Director of Operations at RVE Seoul, also known locally within Kenya as Kudura, which is the name of our mini-grid solution and multi-service offering. So if you hear me use those two interchangeably, that's because they are effectively one and the same. So let's begin. So just a quick background to what we hope to discuss here today. So there's been some good conversation on sort of the regulatory environment. Mukabanji talked a lot about site identification and sort of the strategy behind that. So I plan to focus more on to flesh out a bit of what she was discussing on the community outreach and community integration side, while also exploring a bit more of the productive energy use, and then tying that all into the regulatory environment, investors, and what we need as a sector, and what us developers are looking for in terms of scaling these projects to feasibility. So we are RVE.Seoul, which stands for Rural Village Energy Solutions. Our headquarters, our technology headquarters, are actually based in Leiria in Portugal, which is about halfway between Lisbon and Porto. But our operations, as you can see, are along Eastern Africa, primarily in Kenya. We are a socially inclusive mini-grid developer, so how that differentiates us from some of our competitors is in the sense that most mini-grid providers, when they arrive at a community or a village, they connect what's called the anchor client, which is sort of your high-value productive energy use, which can be something from a lumber mill to a telecom tower or anything in between. and then they connect those with the affordability to pay surrounding that anchor client. Whereas with our model as socially inclusive, we aim to connect 95% of all of the households in the communities that we operate in a premise that we call Universal Basic Utility Access, or UBUA. And so our goal as a firm is to see if we can deliver UBUA in a for-profit model. And the way we help mitigate our revenue risk by connecting essentially the world's poorest people is by offering multi-utility. So in the sense that not only do we offer affordable clean power, but we offer potable drinking water, biogas, Wi-Fi, and a variety of other utilities and services. We've had an on-the-ground pilot project in Western Kenya for the last 7 years. And that's been a great test bed of experimentation for this model, and we have a patent pending on the Kudura platform. This year, we just recently closed our Series A round, and I'll go ahead and post our press release to the webinar chat just now. But we're happy to say that we closed with Aegis, which is France's largest infrastructure and engineering company, along with G7 Energies, which is a South African, a Cape Town-based investment house. So we're very excited that there are some investors out there that are willing to take this leap, and hopefully those are the kind of investments that will catalyze the sector. In addition, we are also secured the GMG DFID facility for this year, and that's allowed us to launch 10 sites covering 15 communities and over 15,000 people this year. So just quickly, an overview of sort of rural village energy solutions and what we do and what we're trying to accomplish here. So we are focused mainly in East Africa. As a Portuguese-based company, we do have some contacts in Mozambique as well, but my focus will be on Kenya. So I will focus mainly on the discussions there. As Aaron had mentioned from AMDA regarding sort of policy side, Kenya is relatively friendly when it comes to policy. In the sense that they seem to be relatively stable and structured. But as he mentioned, we've been hearing about these new energy regulations that are supposed to be ratified any day now. And again, these are the sort of things that us developers are often left in flux. It makes it difficult, one, on the execution and operation side, but then also on the financial investment side. It's hard to convince investors that we can have a permit in hand by X day when the technical regulations aren't even approved yet in Congress. And a good example of that is in Tanzania, which about 2 or 3 years ago was actually essentially favored over Kenya in terms of where the mini-grid sector thought would expand the fastest. But the new president, Magufuli, has come in and sort of put the iron fist down on foreign investment and foreign commercial entity and ownership. So that's really put a pause. And so the relative stable political environment in Kenya makes it quite alluring. So then jumping ahead to sort of how we see the pyramid of sustainable economic development going through mini grids, right? And so the idea is, okay, if we can provide access to energy and access to water, right? We are increasing disposable income by reducing the amount spent on kerosene. We are reducing the amount of waterborne illnesses from clean water, in addition from the smoke inhalation of kerosene. That's also, again, to cooking fuel as well, which we provide by turning manure into biogas. And these are all things that we essentially take for granted a lot of times in the world, but it can make a huge impact on quality of life. So once we provide folks with UBUA, with the basic essentials of the modern world, we hope that folks can leverage these utilities in creating small businesses and operating value-added services. And we assist in doing that by providing appliance finance. So in the sense that a lot of our customers can't even afford to purchase retail, some of the things like a deep fryer or a juicer that they would want to create a business, we offer that to them. In addition to driving this productive use of energy, which we'll flesh out a little bit more. And then all of that, as we kind of get to the top of the pyramid that you see in front of you here, leads to financial independence for our consumers. This idea that now that we have records of their ability to repay finance, their ability to repay appliance finance, their ability to leverage our power, we can then go to small banks and say, hey, listen, you can give this person a loan. Or we can go to insurers and provide people with the options of healthcare and life insurance, things like that. And at the very, very top, you can see sort of that data being encapsulated in this idea of the more we know about the consumers, the more we can help them out. And the more income and the more revenue that these folks generate, the more that they can continually to improve their quality of life and their circumstance. And this is all it comes down to, as Mukabanji was saying, is all about community engagement. So the way we operate our Kadura platform is by having a project management committee, which is nominated by the community-based organization, or the CBO. And so our CBOs are recommended by, so CBOs in general are a collection of leaders within the communities that generally are responsible for pioneering and championing projects in the region or in their community. And so we approach the local government in accordance to the memorandum of understanding that we have with them, and in line with KPLC, which is the local utility, the national utility, to make sure that the communities that we're targeting are not going to be on the grid anytime soon. They're not in the development plans for the grid. And then within the county, making sure that we're working with a good CBO. So because they have so much responsibility in our projects, we want to make sure that these folks have the ability to rally the community, that there's no politics in play, which on the ground it can often be a pretty substantial dynamic that you have to be aware of. And then in addition has a proven track record of being able to execute and manage projects. Once we have the CBO sort of selected and a site picked out according to a lot of the same steps that Mukabanji presented before, we have this project management committee. And through that committee is kind of where everything starts and ends. So our consumers work directly with them. If they have problems, complaints, then come out to us. We drive our KPIs, which is our key performance indicators. So it's well and good for all of us to say mini grids are doing great in the world. Can we prove that, right? So we want to develop with our project committees, how can we measure the impact that we're having on people's lives? Whether it's the amount of disposable income that they have, the amount of female attendance in schools, the prevalence of waterborne diseases. All of these are sort of metrics that we develop with the community to understand, A, where they foresee them, where they have the biggest difficulties in life, and then how have we done in alleviating those difficulties, right? So as you can see, our staff in the top corner is actually just sort of, we're there for support. We provide the hardware, and if anything goes wrong, we're there to alleviate any problems or concerns. But at the end of the day, this is a community project. They understand our consumers better than we ever could. And so we try to empower the self-nominated committee members to do as much as they can for their own communities. And so you'll see, so switching gears a little bit to productive energy use, one of the big things, once we have sites deployed and we've outlaid all this capital, the question is, okay, how do we drive consumption amongst the people that are already on the grid, right? And that's very important because the CapEx has already been spent. We've already connected them to the grid. So the question is, how do we increase the revenue from $25 per month to $50 per month, all the way up to 100 or 120, which for those of you that are developers here will understand that that is a pipe dream that we hope to accomplish. So you can see here, this is a courtesy of the Alliance for Rural Electrification, who our founder is the current president of. You can see a couple of the high energy uses that we see. And I'm going to focus on the ones with stars, which are effectively where we operate primarily in Western Kenya, are kind of the key commercial value chains that we see. So that's battery charging. As most of you will know, that every single person that we come across in these rural areas has a phone, right? And these folks spend a very, very long time traveling to places with power to charge their phone. And then that costs money, whether it's a boat ride or a taxi ride, or the time spent traveling to the actual charge that they have to pay to charge the phone. But at the end of the day, this is a fundamental aspect of their lives that we hope to improve by bringing power into people's homes. And then, of course, TV, radio, internet. One of the interesting feedback we got when we were holding a community negotiation is I made sure some young guy got the opportunity to speak, and asked him what he was most excited for about Kadura. And he said, well, I don't have to walk 15 kilometers to watch the Manchester City game. So a lot of the same aspirations and the same things that we all wish to have in our houses are the same things in these rural communities. So as much as we'd like to say, oh, let's focus on chicken rearing, or let's focus on or ice for the fish value chain, at the end of the day, a lot of times the folks in these communities just want access to the same basic pleasures of life that we have. And that's sort of going back to quality of life. And again, carpentry is a big one, and welding, which I'll throw metal work as well. So the idea that having productive value-added services readily in the community. And then, of course, the last one being grinding, milling, and husking, which is sort of the agricultural value chain, which is a very fundamental part of the lives of these communities, as about 80 to 90% of all of our customers are subsistence farmers. So on that last note, this grinding, milling, and husking, I want to take a quick moment to talk about the pasho mill dilemma. So pasho mills is essentially a grain mill. And so if you speak from Energy for Impact all the way out to developers and SE for all, everyone in between is always really gung-ho about the idea of the pasho mill because they consume a massive amount of diesel. They're everywhere in rural communities. Essentially, their function is to grind grains, whether that's millet or maize, generally the main two, into powdered form, which can then be used to create ugali or pap or sadza, or sort of the local subsistence food. And so there's this huge push to try to get pasho mills onto our mini grids. And it seems like a great idea, but unfortunately it is really very, very difficult to execute. The reason why is these things chow a ton of power when they're in use. It's sometimes over 50%, if not closer to 80% of the capacity of the grids that we deploy, which causes quite a dilemma, as Nico was discussing earlier on sort of load balancing. We spend all of our time encouraging people to use their power in the daytime, not at nighttime, because that's when the solar power is available. But if we have a pasho mill running that's chowing 80% of our available capacity, now all of a sudden we have to do the exact opposite. We have to disincentivize, or we have to incentivize consumers not to use power in the daytime after spending all this time encouraging daytime use. And so we have to get creative with sort of the tariff structure, maybe a power happy hour or something like that, in which we convince our users not to use in the daytime and to use at nighttime. But then again, as an operations guy, I can tell you, effectively conveying that sort of change in tariff or that change in incentive is a really difficult thing. In addition, so if we want to put a bunch of these pasho mills onto our grid, now we have to overspec our generation capacity. And if anyone in the development space knows, is that the CapEx outlay is kind of the fundamental hurdle behind raising capital. And the idea is, how do we make sure that we're not putting systems that are too large out in the field that are only going to be utilized 40%? And the idea is, okay, if now we have these pasho mills that we are required to have very high peak watts for, now all of a sudden we're going to spend most of our time, sub utilization in preparation for having pasho mills on. So that causes a problem in terms of CapEx per connection costs. And of course, these pasho mills aren't used every day. They're used seasonally. In Kenya, there's two main harvests, and they're used for about a month or two within that harvest season. So for 4 months out of the year, you have this massive watt tying up your peak wattage in those periods, and then about 6 to 8 months of the year in which it's idle. So you can see you can see all the difficulties in getting pasho mills onto solar mini grid power. So as much as, and this is still something that we work with other developers with folks like Aaron at AMDA to see how can we try to incentivize grant aid or perhaps sort of creative financing mechanisms to get these things on, because there's no doubt about the value of, if we can do this correctly, how good it'll do both for the environment and for, again, this idea of empowering economic growth and development. So quick
Robert, can you wrap this up really in 30 seconds if possible?
Yeah, sure. So just to wrap up, I think that the key takeaways is that once you're on the ground, your job's not done. If you have the CapEx raised and you're out there working, that's really the start of it. This is a customer industry, and it requires community management, county negotiations, national discussions with governments. And so it's not a one and done field. Once you're out there, that's really where the fun begins. And so if anyone has any follow-up questions, I'd love to take this either on the Q&A session or afterwards. But in light of that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very, very much, Aaron. This was very exciting, like other presentations were. We're now well over time. We started late and we had some technical glitches, but it also seems like we were a bit overly ambitious with the program. The good news is we haven't lost many participants so far. So this really speaks for our presenters and the presentations. And I thank everyone for staying on. If you can't stay on, you have to hop off. We'll share the slides later on, and this public session has been recorded. For the members of the community of practice, this is obviously cutting into our follow-up session, which is a closed session where you have a chance to ask the presenters personal questions, discuss your country cases. This is cutting into this time, but I think for good reasons. This is very, very interesting what we're learning here, and the fact that most of you are staying on really shows that. So our last speaker is Caroline Nyland. She has recently founded Helios Infinitus, which is a business that does advisory services and business development and management across Africa, where she has lived for many years, and where she has done a lot of work. Before she founded Helios as the director of the Foundation Rural Energy Services, she's still continuing with FRES as a board member of 5 of their companies, and she's also a vice president of or former vice president of the Alliance for Rural Electrification, which is a great ally of our work, has become a great ally of our work on mini-grids in Africa as well. So Caroline, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Alexander. Can you hear me? Hello?
Maybe you can bring up your volume a little bit. You were hard to hear. We see your presentation, which we're running from Berlin.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Alexander?
We can hear you, but you are very quiet.
You're very quiet, yeah, Caroline.
Yeah, I don't know what I can do.
Maybe Karen can bring up the volume.
Maybe other panelists, are you, or other listeners, are you having trouble hearing Caroline, or is it okay?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Caroline. It's just quiet. I think if people say that they're having a problem, we can stop, but maybe it makes sense to just continue. Caroline, please continue.
Okay. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody. And well, I know we don't have so much time, so I try to make it shorter. I hope most of you can hear me.
No, the volume is still very low.
Yeah, but I think I did the same as in the test phase, so more I cannot do. That's the problem.
Please just go ahead. We can hear you. It's soft, but we'll have to manage with this. So please go ahead.
Okay. I was just a short introduction. I was involved for 20 years in setting up small-scale electricity companies in Africa, West East Africa, and South Africa, and involved in mini grids and solar home systems. And I was also lobbying a lot with governments on tariffs and concession and tax exemptions, and also lobbying a lot with donors to find subsidy for activities in rural electrification. I just want to focus, I was asked to focus on the success of rural electrification programs in West Africa, and to provide some reasons, strengths, why in some country in West Africa some programs have been successful. And to make it shorter, as we don't have so much time, I will just focus specifically on Mali, because Mali seems to be, for many people, still an unknown case. Well, it was a success in some way. As you can see in this first slide, you can see that I have given an overview that from some countries in West Africa. I've given, you can see the mini grid program in use. You can see the years in operation when the program have been implemented. You can see the number of mini-grid concessionaires or permissionaires, like we say in French, and you see the number of mini-grids in operations and the number of connections that have been the number of households that have been connected. I must say that these figures have been from end of 2015, start of 2016. So some figures might be not completely accurate or updated. I know for Mali it's quite accurate. Also Burkina Faso, I think, but Senegal, I'm not sure. So my apologies if some figures are not completely accurate. What you see here is that some of the programs have, one of the questions from Alexander was why some programs have started in 2003. In 1999, Électricité de France, the national electricity company from France, has set up a mini-grid in Mali. And this has inspired replication in other projects. And at the same time, there was a conference in 2000, 2001. There was a conference in, I think it was Senegal, Burkina Faso, a conference launched by the World Bank for renewable energies in Africa. And this has inspired specifically Mali, but also other countries, to start working also with rural electrification and renewable energies. So that's why you see some of the programs started in 2003. Here, I just want to point out that in Mali, you see that Mali has the high number of connections, the high number of concessionaires and mini-grids. And there have been this because of the program that we call Projet de candidature spontanée d'électrification rurale. So this is a kind of spontaneous, bottom-up mini-grid concessionaires that have led to 70,000 households, a connection of 78,000 households that have been connected. Please, the next slide. Yes, thank you. Here, I just want to show you that Mali started with 3 approaches, of which with the World Bank support, AMADER is the Rural Electrification Agency in Mali. AMADER launched or tendered out rural zone concessions of 10,000 households, together with the World Bank support. At the beginning of 2000, it was 1999, I think, or 1998. The exact date, I don't know exactly, but it was the end of 90s, the beginning of 2000. And but there was this was with no success. And then the second approach was the call for proposals, also led by the World Bank with AMADER. And this call for proposals also didn't really have success. So then AMADER decided to launch to ask to project developers and local initiatives in the country to come up with their own proposals, whereby local developers came with with their areas where they want to operate and the choice of renewable energy technology. And the setting up of the project was completely done, and the feasibility studies also, everything was done by the local developers. They all submitted proposals to AMADER, and they received a preliminary permit on the basis of manifest of interest, and then they worked out the proposals together also with AMADER. But it was really a bottom-up approach. So, and a two-way cooperation between the government and the operators. And this approach really increased the ownership and the knowledge from the bottom. And it created also more support from local entrepreneurs initiatives and allows for more flexibility in managing the projects. And this allows also for more dynamics of the projects. And just to conclude, for this slide, the spontaneous local proposal, what we call the PKCR, was really a success in Mali. And even in, I have been working in the context of this approach together with press for nearly 12 years. And I must say, it was really a success. And well, I will tell a little bit more why it was so important. The benefit of the bottom-up approach is that it attracts significant interest from small entrepreneurs and local initiatives. And you see that this project continued to develop and operate mini-grids under concession agreements. And under this model, interested parties proposed to Amadea to build mini-grids with a generation capacity of less than 250 kilowatts in a certain area. And the majority of this project are powered by diesel, were powered by diesel generators, but more and more, some of them have been converted to hybrid solar diesel or 100% solar with support from the World Bank funds. So you see that private operators in Mali typically manage between 1 to 15 mini grids at the same time. And so there are big concessionaires and small concessionaires. And Amadea subsidized the investment cost of new connections and capital investment for 75%. And so private operators had to bring in 25% in the projects. The tariff allowed that were allowed were between, or are still between 250 and 250 francs CFA. In euro cents, it's between 0.32 euro cents and 0.38 euro cents per kilowatt hour. And well, I can say a lot about these tariffs, but that's not now the aim of my presentation. And Amadea is still building on its experience with this program, this PKCR, and is still encouraging private concessionaires to build out larger projects and not working only with 250 kilowatt peak, but also more, and also to convert all the diesel generators into the hybrid or 100% solar. And this is happening since, well, let's say 3-4 years. You see that more and more operators are trying to convert their diesel mini grids into hybrid or solar mini grids. Can I now show the next slide? This is just to show you in the next 2 slides, I just want to show you 2 approaches in Burkina Faso. This is also a bottom-up approach. This is led by cooperatives by village leaders and entrepreneurs. And they also are supported by the government, and the cooperative recruits builders and private technical operators to supply electricity, and they receive some financing support from the government. Some of the cooperatives generate their own power, and but there are still a huge amount of a huge number of cooperatives that distribute power purchased on contract from the national electricity company. But you can see in the like I showed in the first slide, this also led to let's say 15,000 connections, households that have been provided with electricity. Thank you. The next slide. Well, this is also the 2 approaches that we see in Senegal that were not quite successful, as you could see in the first slide. A lot of lot of struggle with the governments. I heard about a lot of projects, I saw also a lot of projects still struggling with the government, how to really operate and cooperate together, and a lot of issues also on tariffs, the tariffs that can be applied in this project. And well, I won't go into this. If there are questions, you can always ask me later on. Maybe the next slide. Here, I just want to summarize some strengths of the rural electrification framework in Mali. And here you see that I try to show, at least from my experience, what is needed to support and to make electrification framework in a country a success. At least the policies the overall policies and all documents from the government should at least stipulate the priority for rural electrification and use of renewable energies. This is really important because this shows at least the position of the government. So there is something to talk about with them, because they also align with our activities. At the same time, what I really saw in Mali is that AMADER, the Rural Electrification Agency, really holds a great deal of responsibility over the rural electrification sector, serving as promoter and regulator. Of course, some of you might say, yes, that's a pitfall because it's a combination of two roles. But I must say that it really helped to have one agency where we could really negotiate and discuss everything, every issue we had when operating in Mali. And but at the same time, it can be a pitfall. Like Nico also said, tariff adjustment could be free of political interference if it is not always if the regulator is separated from the agency. At the same time, we had a close cooperation with the AMADER and the Ministry of Energy, and I was really impressed by the fast processing of our questions and issues. Although I know not everybody would agree with that, but I think if I compare to the countries where I also operated in Uganda and Burkina Faso, other countries, I think Mali was really very, very fast in working together with the operators. Another point is staff AMADER, well trained, well aware of the challenges of rural electrification, well adequate in finding a consensus and fast processing of issues. We also have a very well elaborated and complete authorization contract, together with an annex with standards, conditions. Everything is stipulated in these contracts and annexes. And so for every issue, you just have to look back to these contracts, and then you have a ground for discussion. And this really helps as for a director, a managing director of a company, to really have a good discussion and a good solvence of issues with the government. We had a time concessions or authorization, we don't call it concession, but we had an authorization for a permit for authorization of operation in Mali for 15 years. And this also allowed to work as a sole operator in that area. Well, I already said the bottom-up approach was really a benefit, and it attracted significantly interest from small, medium entrepreneurs and local initiatives, as you can see. And I also find the transparency of some policies in Mali, especially when we talk about grid extension. As an operator, you want to know where is the grid going to be extended. Especially last years, we had a lot of you see a lot of grid extension in the country in Mali, and as a rural electrification off-grid operator, you want to know where is the grid going. What do we have to take into consideration as future issues? We had a lot of and still a lot of regular meetings between Ministry of Energy, Amadeus, and different and all the operators, and this also helps for better comprehension of each other's issues. And so it's all about a combination of political will, of clear policies, clear, well-elaborated authorizations contracts, and ownership supported from the bottom, and good governance and transparency about all issues in the rural electrification sector. And then I'm not Caroline Island if I don't show also what we can improve. So maybe the last slide. Yeah, I just mentioned some improvements that can be done, because there's always space or room to improve. So Aaron and the other speakers already mentioned some of them, and I think it's we have to put more efforts to mitigate the risks related to the regulation, economical, fiscal, political policy issues. It's really important. Then I still think we need public support for most of the at this moment. We still need a public support in terms of grants also. Then we should benchmark more between the companies, but also between the countries, between the mini-grids initiatives. I've been always advocating for that. I've made even a start with that, because then you don't have to reinvent always the wheel, and you can really see and perceive what is really working, what has helped in other countries. We are not doing it enough, so we should do it enough. Then it is important to have dedicated institutional structures and to have an independence from political agendas to ensure that efforts are sustainable and are not interfered according to political personal agendas. This is also related to the last point. I think we need a revision of the legal framework in Mali, especially because there are new issues arising in Mali, like we were confronted with the taken over of some of our mini-grids. But in the contract there is no conditions, or no right. There's no right for the operators. There's no conditions. So what do you take into account when the government wants to take over some of your mini grids? What can you do? How can you act? And this kind of new issues also should be stipulated in the legal frameworks. Very important, because if not, you are left alone, and then you don't have so much ground to defend yourself. And at the same time, tariff negotiations and tariff adjustment is something that I've worked a lot. Have not been easy to increase every time the tariff, but it should be also improved because it will make the daily job of every managing director of a company much easier if these conditions are and the formulas are much clearer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Over to Josh for some final words. I want to say, it's unfortunate that we don't have more time for Q&A. Many questions have been addressed already in the chat window. We're going to make sure that those that haven't been answered yet will be forwarded to the presenters and they can get in touch with you. Josh, over to you. Of course, our community of practice members will have a chance to continue the discussion with the speakers in the closed session that's starting at 15 past the full hour.
Thank you very much, Alex. You pretty much covered a lot of what I wanted to say. Just to mention that there was still a couple of questions outstanding in the chat panel and also in the Q&A box. At this point, we are frightfully over time, so I'm going to suggest that we will connect the question askers with the speakers and make sure that there is an offline exchange so that those questions can be answered. At this point, we would have very much like to address them within the webinar, but sadly we cannot do that because we've got another meeting that's been waiting for a while. Mine very briefly is to thank everybody. I see we still have close to 42 attendees in addition to our panelists. We really appreciate your forbearance with us going over time like this, but I believe that it was well worth it. And a big thank you to all of the panelists, the speakers who gave us some really, really good input. To all attendees, I know a couple of you have been asking, the presentation will be made available. So as long as you registered for the webinar and you're with us here, you will have those presentations. And I am hoping that there will be follow-up discussions either between you and the panelists on a one-on-one basis, or there will be other forums in which we can do that. So thank you very much to those of you who attended the open session. We are going to be beginning the closed session for the community practice members. Thank you very much, and please do keep an eye out for announcements in the future for more of the more webinars from the mini-grids community of practice, as well as our FOLU community of practice and the Africa-led partnership as a whole. Thank you so much, and have a lovely afternoon wherever you might be. Thank you.